Hello and welcome, folks. Thank you for your patience as we just sorted out the last couple of details. My name is Beth Ann Fisher. I'm the Spiritual and Community Life Program Coordinator at Emmanuel College. And on behalf of the Center for Religion and its Context, Assalamu alaikum, welcome to today's conversation. Today, our conversation, Indigenous and Muslim Perspectives on Colonization, Treaties and Decolonisation, is co-hosted and sponsored by Justice for All Canada and Olive Tree Foundation. The Center for Religion and its Context, through academic and continuing education events, shares its distinctive contextual approach to the study of religion in all aspects: theology and belief, historical development, lived experience, and diversity of expressions in the United Church of Canada and in other Christian contexts, as well as in Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, and other religious understandings. For upcoming events hosted by the Center, please visit our website, and I will post into the chat our website link shortly. As we begin today, I would like to start with territorial land acknowledgement. As we gather together, we acknowledge the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates and the land on which I am personally situated. This area has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. As a settler, I take on the responsibility of learning about historic and current relationships and my desire to engage in building right relations. I'm also mindful of broken covenants and the need to strive to make right with all our relations. Now, I don't know if you know where you are situated yourselves in terms of Indigenous territory, but this website is a great way to find that out if you don't already know. If you visit this website, you can see who are the Indigenous peoples who have existed and flourished and lived and cared for the land that you find yourselves on. And I want to encourage you to do that either now or later on. And finally, a couple of brief housekeeping details before we begin. First, please make sure that your Zoom name is the name that you use to register for this event. You should be able to change your name by going to that square of your image, and the top right corner, there should be 3 dots. And if you click on those 3 dots, a menu will pop up and one of them will say rename close to the bottom. And if you choose rename, you'll be able to adjust your name. And if you would like to, you're also welcome to include your pronouns in your name. We welcome you to do that if it's something that you would like to do. Please remain on mute throughout our conversation today so that there's no audio interference with our panelists and our guests. And questions for the Q&A can be sent via the chat to Kathy B, who's our moderator today, and you'll meet shortly. So our chat function is turned off since we're a large group, but you can message directly to the hosts and co-hosts if you have any questions. And like I said, questions for the Q&A can be sent to Kathy B. And final note, we are recording our conversation today to be shared online at a later time. So I just want to let you know that. And if you are not comfortable with yourself being shown on screen, you're absolutely welcome to turn your camera off, although we will be spotlighting our panelists and have them be the center focus. So they'll be the ones who are being recorded. So with that said, I would like to invite Taha Gayur from Justice for All Canada to share some words of welcome.
Okay, well, thank you and good afternoon and assalamu alaikum, peace be with you all. As a co-sponsor of this very timely conversation, I would like to welcome you all to Indigenous and Muslim Perspectives on Colonization, Treaties and Decolonisation. And I would like to personally thank Dr. Naveen Rida, Sean Houston, Beth and Fisher, Dr. Katherine Bullock, and I'm sure many others behind the scenes for organizing today's wonderful event. Justice for All Canada is a human rights advocacy organization with a consultative status with the United Nations, and it is focused on countering human rights violations and genocides impacting Indigenous minorities around the world, including Rohingyas in Myanmar, Uyghurs in East Turkestan, or as known as China, situated in current day China, or occupied by China, Kashmiris, of course, as well as other religious minorities in India. Last year, Justice for All Canada also launched solidarity campaigns to highlight the ongoing persecution and genocides of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And from our perspective, it would be, injustice in itself to be advocating for Indigenous peoples around the world who are being persecuted and not calling out ongoing genocide and colonization of Indigenous peoples right here on our own soil in this land. And this has led us to launch a historic initiative called Muslim Indigenous Connections Program, where a select group of Muslim youth or Muslim youth leaders in Canada are brought together for a 4 to 5 month journey to learn about the Indigenous peoples, cultures, faith, struggles, and pains directly from the Indigenous leaders and elders. And more importantly, it teaches Muslim youth allyship with the Indigenous peoples. So with that, we are very excited and humbled to be part of this collaborative event today to further highlight and discuss and hear from our experts on this very critical topic of parallels of colonization and decolonization between Indigenous and Muslim communities around the world and Canada in particular. Thank you for doing this today.
Thank you so much, Taha. I'm also going to invite Munib Nasir from the Olive Tree Foundation to share some words of welcome.
Peace be with you. Assalamu alaikum. Today, I'm joining you from the city of Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and the Chippewa Bands. The Olive Tree Foundation is once again pleased to co-sponsor this program with Emmanuel College and the Center for Religion and Context. The Olive Tree Foundation is a charitable foundation that promotes community development to address compelling needs and priorities in the society. olivetreefoundation.ca is our website. At this time, please join me in an opening invocation, a dua. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, most merciful and loving God, giver of life and guider of hearts, praise and glory be to you. Guide us to your blessed paths, the path of righteousness. Most merciful and loving God, we pray for unity, understanding, and a peaceful resolution of issues facing the Indigenous peoples of this land and all settlers of Turtle Island. May our hearts be open to all peoples and nations of the earth, and may we recognize that we share a common humanity. Ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another. In our community, we are many different people. We come from many different places, have many different cultures and faiths and spiritualities. Open our hearts that we may be bold in finding the riches of inclusion and the treasures of diversity among us. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you, O God, have endowed in each of us, and may we always appreciate our deep interconnectedness as common citizens of one earth. O living, O sustained God, in your mercy we seek relief from the pain and suffering in the world. Help us to obtain the strength for the sake of the weary, hope for those who are discouraged, and joy for each and everyone who is downhearted. O God, your peace, and from you comes peace. Blessed are you, the majestic and generous. Amen. At this time, I would like to introduce you to the moderator of today's program, Dr. Katherine Bullock. She's a TV host for Sang Vision Foundation's Canadian Muslim News and director of special programs. She's also a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. She's currently the president of Compass Books, dedicated to publishing top quality books about Islam and Muslims in English. She's the past president of Tessalit Institute and the Islamic Society of North America in Canada. At this time, I introduce Dr. Bullock and pass it on to her.
Thank you, Brother Muneeb. Assalamu alaikum, and greetings of peace to everyone here today. I acknowledge gratefully that I live and work on Treaty Land number 14, which is called the Head of Lake Purchase. It was signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit in 1806. They were given 1,000 pounds of trade goods and some fishing rights along the river. It is now the home to the cities that are called Burlington, Oakville, and Mississauga. Today and yesterday, we learned of the discovery of more unmarked graves at a Canadian residential school in Saskatchewan at the Kaycikusi First Nation. I'm at a loss for words, actually, so I'm very grateful to Brother Muneeb for his excellent prayer and invocation and ceremony at the beginning, for his words that conveyed our anguish and pain. I pray for healing and justice and reconciliation, and that I can be part of what is good and not part of what is bad. Today, the conversation is around treaties. This can seem very abstract and decolonisation, but it's actually not about history. Many white people, including myself until I was educated properly, and immigrants to Canada, don't really understand the importance of what happened in the past. I wasn't there is a common phrase, and many feel resentful at being held accountable for something that happened in the past that they say they weren't there for. What we need to understand is that we weren't there in 1806 or in any of those other eras when treaties were signed or not signed, disregarded, and made fun of by the colonists. But we are here now, and we are the beneficiaries of what happened. So we live on an injustice, and it's a very hard thing to grapple with and to come to terms with. We must play our part in bringing about justice and healing and reconciliation. As somebody rooted in the academy, but also in activism, a panel on a topic of treaty and decolonisation can seem very abstract, very ivory towerish, very remote. But in fact, thought leadership is crucial in helping shape the way language helps shape our understanding of things, both past, present, and how to move forward. So thought leadership is crucial. And therefore, I'm very honoured today to be joined by three outstanding scholars who have been working and researching in these areas of treaty and decolonisation from different perspectives for many decades. I won't read the whole bios. They are on the event website in the interest of time, because it's more important that you hear from our speakers than from me. I'm honoured to welcome the Director for the Centre of Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto and Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies and History. University of Manitoba Press has published her book called The Clay We Are Made Of, Haudenosaunee Land Tenure on the Grand River. She has a PhD in Native Studies from Trent University and participated in language immersion programs I was going to try to pronounce the languages, but I've decided not to be that brave. But I think it's Mohawk and Cayuga languages. This is Dr. Susan Hill. We welcome you. Then we have coming, okay, maybe I'll do each one by one. So Dr. Susan Hill, we welcome you.
For that introduction, Kathy, and I also wanted to give a duty.
Dr. Susan, we can't hear you right now. There seems to be a connection problem. Is there anything we can do to boost the signal?
Is that any better?
Actually, you're zoning in and out. We hear a few words and not a few words.
Okay, let me, if you want to move me, I can try to connect on another device.
All right, then I'll move on to the next speaker and we'll come back to you. Our next speaker then, a Métis Canadian Muslim who converted to Islam at age 16 many years ago. I probably shouldn't say how many to make him feel like he's still as young as he looks. He has a PhD in Hispanic Nature and Islamic Studies from University of Toronto, yay. A postdoctorate in Arabic from Fez and Rabat. His most influential book called The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the World. Welcome, Dr. John Andrew Morrow. And please remember to unmute before you speak.
All right, better? Can you hear me now? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. While there were thousands of indigenous tribes, peoples, and nations with a myriad of religious beliefs, spiritual practices, and political organization throughout the Americas, the indigenous people from the Eastern Woodlands share the 7 grandfather teachings in common: wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. Consequently, our word is our bond. We are expected to honor our treaties, and by and large, we have, unless we were compelled to do otherwise for reasons of desperation or self-preservation. The same can be said of most Muslims. The Quran calls upon Muslims to abide by the covenants and treaties that they conclude with non-Muslims, and to never violate them, unless and until they are broken by the opposing party. The Quran commands Muslims to keep their promises, fulfill their oaths, and honor their treaties. Fulfill the covenant of God and do not break the contract. 1320. Do not break oaths after their confirmation, while you have made God over you a witness. 1691. For verily, success is attained by those who honestly look after their trusts and covenants. 22:8. The Quran, however, warns against making treaties with those who respect not the ties of kinship or of covenant. 9:8. The Prophet Muhammad was adamant that Muslims had to respect their treaty obligations. He said that only a hypocrite broke his oath. I do not renege on a covenant, he asserted in Abu Dawud, Nisa'i, and Ibn Hayyan. Whenever he concluded a treaty, he would say, we fulfill the covenant for them, and we seek help from God against them. That was narrated by Muslim. The Prophet concluded covenants with the idolaters of Medina, Mecca, and other regions. The Prophet concluded covenants with the Jews of Medina, the Yemen, Khaybar, and Makna. He concluded covenants with the Samaritans of Palestine and the Zoroastrians of Persia. He concluded covenants with the Christians of Najran, Jerusalem, Mesopotamia, Persia, Armenia, the Sinai, and the world. The Messenger of God prohibited Muslims from persecuting the peoples of the book. Whoever oppresses a Jew or a Christian, I will testify against him on the day of judgment. This is found in Bukhari, Abu Dawud, Mawardi, Abu Nuaym, Baladhuri, and Jalabi. Observe scrupulously the protection accorded to me to non-Muslim subjects. This was reported by Suyuti. Whoever does an injustice to a Jew or a Christian decreases his right, burdens him for that which he cannot afford, or take something from him unwittingly, I will raise a complaint against him on the day of judgment. This is found in Abu Yusuf. The messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, never violated a treaty. As for the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, it is well known and accepted that the Quraysh violated its terms. Treaties are not one-sided. It takes two to tango. If the idolaters did not wish to dance in peace and preferred to make war and raid, rob, and murder Muslims, then the Prophet Muhammad was not bound to uphold his end of the agreement. While I will not give carte blanche to all Muslim leaders and individuals from all times and pretend that they were perfect, I will say unequivocally that all righteous, God-fearing Muslim rulers strove to respect the treaties and covenants that the Prophet Muhammad concluded with the peoples of the book, and that the best of them extended these protections to people of all faith and of no faith. The Jews, the Christians, the Samaritans, and the Zoroastrians were protected as peoples of the book, or Ahl al-Kitab, whereas the Hindus, the Buddhists, and other groups were treated as Ahl al-Dhimma, namely the people of protection, citizens and subjects entitled to life and liberty. This was the case with the Mughals of India. This was also the case with the Ottomans. In fact, Muhammad's covenants with non-Muslim communities became a blueprint for peace agreements between the Ottomans and their tributaries. The Ottomans distinguished between Christians who were friends and allies of the Muslims and those who were at war with them. In fact, the Sultan was prohibited from taking any belligerent action against the covenanted Christian community unless and until the highest ranking Muslim religious and political authorities had established beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had collectively violated their contractual obligations. The whole was not punished for the action of the part. The situation in the traditional Muslim world can be contrasted to that of the Americas. The United States entered into more than 500 treaties with Native American tribes between 1778 and 1871. All of them have been violated in part or in whole by the US government. Indigenous Americans continue to fight for the rights to this day, an effort that seems futile since the federal courts that deal with treaty rights are like swamps, muskeg, and quicksand. Native Americans have been stuck in them for centuries. They sap their strength. It drains their limited financial resources. The system sucks them down as it was designed to do, to deprive them of the little rights they have. Hence, for some Indigenous people, the solution to our problems is internal and starts with self-sufficiency. It's about independence, not dependence. We do not ask for rights, we assert them. We do not ask the colonizer for sovereignty, we claim it. As for Canada, most of the treaties with Indigenous peoples were signed less than 150 years ago. Whether they involve the First Nations, the Inuit, or the Métis, they represent a history of broken promises. The sores are open, they are raw, and they sting. One of the advantages of multiculturalism, it could be argued, is the influx of immigrants who have also suffered from imperialism and colonization. Some of them can empathize with the predicament and plight of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada and partner with them in the joint struggle for human rights and the dignity of the human person. We are faced with a plethora of social, political, economic, and spiritual problems and scores of potential solutions. We can only touch upon some of them in speeches, panels, and presentations. We cannot address them all, nor can we solve them all. As individuals, we must start with ourselves, with our minds, with our souls. We must care for our physical health and our mental health. We must care for our intellects through education. We must cultivate our spirituality. That could be through traditional Indigenous beliefs or any other religious system. Religion provides hope and inculcates values. Some Indigenous people are leftists, some are secular humanists. The key is to have some anchor in life and some sort of moral compass. Embrace positive beliefs and adopt positive values that do not contradict our traditional teachings. We need to elevate, not degenerate. I may be a Muslim, but I do not want to see Aboriginal people embrace the ideology of ISIS and commit atrocities in Syria and elsewhere. Religion can be an opiate. Religion can be a delusion, a source of sickness and a disease. However, religion can also be a cure, a source of solace and a saving grace. When it comes to decolonization, we need to tread carefully. We must not throw out the baby with the bathwater. We take what is good and we reject what is bad. We should not be stagnant. Everything but the creator evolves. Languages evolve, cultures evolve, societies evolve, laws evolve, science evolves. We're not interested in moving backwards. We're not interested in a freeze-dried or fossilized way of life. While we should be conscious of the past, we must live in the present with our eyes on the future. We need to fix ourselves before we can help to fix others. And when we help others, we help our immediate family first, then our extended family, then our neighborhood, our community, our city, our province, our state, our nation, our continent, and finally, the planet. Mother Earth as a whole. We cannot do everything, but we must do something. Pick a cause, one cause, and pursue it. Addiction, domestic violence, human trafficking, missing and exploited women, education, mental health, spiritual development, political advocacy, and environmental protection. How about art, culture, music, dance, theater, and cinema, entrepreneurship, business development? Eat healthy, exercise, finish high school, get a GED, start a daycare, become a millionaire, become a billionaire, but give back to your people. Respect your elders, be kind to children, smile, take small steps. Just move, because movement is life. I am a work in progress. We all are. We must live and learn. We must grow. And like DNA, we must pass it on and transmit information, knowledge, heritage, culture, and values to the next generation. The project of building up a people is generational. Merci, thank you. Mina kawapamatin. Au revoir, see you soon. Ila liqa, hasta luego. Ciao. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May peace and blessings be upon you all.
Thank you, Dr. John. I love your multilingual finale there. Let's now see if Dr. Susan has fixed her internet connection, and we welcome her back.
How's the sound now?
Keep talking and we'll see.
How's the sound for you?
I need you to talk a little more for me to be able to tell. So far it's okay. Fine, but keep talking.
All right, I will just dive in and hopefully that works.
Yes.
Yeah, just wave a hand if it's not. So thank you so much for all of the greetings today and all of the beautiful words that have already been shared. I want to start with some of the words that come from the place where I come from. So I've greeted you in the Gayokono or Cayuga language, and that is one of the original languages of the land upon which we all live and work. And I specifically greet you today from the Six Nations of the Grand River territory where my home is. And I'm honored to be included in today's conversation. I wanted to share just a few slides, and hopefully it will help keep me on track. I do occasionally go off on tangents, and I very much appreciate that Kathy will help signal if I've taken more time than is my share. So as I said, I am very honored to be a part of today's conversation. I know that I have much to learn from my Muslim neighbors and from all of the people who've taken time out to be a part of today's conversation. I just wanted to start with an image of a wampum belt that documents what I see as the foundational relationship that is the basis for my part in this conversation today, as well as the part of most people who would be a part of today's conversation. So anybody who is not Indigenous to the Americas, this document is relevant to everybody present in this territory.
Like our family members.
I'm hearing somebody else's voice. I'm sorry. Is everything okay sound-wise?
I think so. We'll just make sure everyone else is on mute. Continue.
Okay. So this is known as the Dignity de Ojade, or the Chiro Wampum Belt, and it is the physical document, the first treaty that was made in what we call North America between my ancestors, the Haudenosaunee, and the first European visitors who stayed in this land, the Dutch. And it is the forebearer of the relationship that followed, particularly with the British Empire, which we know still continues to have a presence in this territory. I just, because I'm a historian and I'm a nerd, I wanted to just give folks some terms to consider when they're thinking about treaty relationships, and understanding and recognizing that in this part of the world, there are at least 3 different categories of treaties that we can talk about. The first would be treaties that were made between Indigenous nations, many of which predate the last 5 centuries, although there are ones that have come more recently. There are also the Indigenous European treaties and European settler treaties, of which most conversations in what is known as Canada talk about this kind of treaty, as well as land cession treaties. So those are just some broad categories that might help people in thinking about treaty in its different contexts in this part of the world. And here are some other visuals of examples of some of these treaties. The top one is another picture of the Chiro Wampum. The second image from the top that you see is the wampum belt that commemorates what's known as the covenant chain relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the English. And this relationship, the ideas of it, were borrowed by the British government in their treaty relations that were developed with many other Indigenous nations in the Great Lakes region primarily. And you'll see, if you're into historical records, you'll often see reference to the covenant chain, applied not only to British relations with the Haudenosaunee, but also with other nations, including the Anishinaabe. The third image down is from the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. It has a lot of relevance to this part of the world, and is really the Indigenous documentation of the conversations that the British Empire had with Indigenous nations after the Royal Proclamation. And so this one is very important in thinking about the context of the legal orders that apply in Canada today. And there's a lot of brilliant work being done by historical legal scholars around the responsibilities to the Treaty of Niagara when thinking about Canadian law. And I'd particularly make note of the work by people like Heidi Stark, Alan Corbier, Rick Hill, and John Burroughs. And the fourth wampum belt is one that's less known, but I would suggest to you is equally important. And it is the belt that was presented at the Treaty of Burlington in 1815, following the War of 1812. And this is the belt that commemorates the reinstatement and recognition of all previous treaty responsibilities that were held by the British Empire to the Indigenous peoples of North America. Here, I just share a basic map of the Great Lakes region, the lower Great Lakes region. And I wanted to highlight the orange zones that you see here around all of Lake Erie and north parts of Lake Ontario. And I use this map because it's one that references a treaty that is often left out of contemporary conversations in the Toronto area in terms of treaty history and treaty obligations. And this is referencing the 1701 Nansan Treaty, also known as the Fort Albany Treaty and the Beaver Hunting Grounds. And this was a treaty made between the British and the Haudenosaunee in Albany in 1701, shortly after the Great Peace of Montreal Treaty Conference, like the next month, this one happened. And obviously the Great Peace of Montreal was a French treaty with Indigenous peoples. This is a counterpart British treaty with a number of those Indigenous folks, particularly the Haudenosaunee. And this particular treaty is one, as I said, doesn't get a whole lot of conversation, but one that you're going to be hearing more about in the coming months, particularly coming out of the leadership of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Council, which is the original government of the Haudenosaunee people. And we're working on a publicity campaign to help people understand the importance of this treaty as it relates to the land on which we all live and work. And understanding particularly the important point that this was not a surrender of land. I won't go into tons of detail about this, but when we think about this region that we all know well, it is highly relevant to the conversations that we want to be having about solidarities and particularly about decolonization. Often in the Canadian context, when treaties are acknowledged, it's the land cession treaties that people refer to, because those are the ones that Canada is comfortable talking about. Canada is far less comfortable talking about earlier treaties with the British Empire, despite the fact that we know Canada is very tied to their ongoing relationships with the British Empire. It's the queen on our money, after all, right? You don't put people on your money who you don't see as important governors of the land. So with that, I will get off my British conversation. But yes, I felt that it was really important to add this piece because I know that it's not often included in conversations around treaty, and one that I'm looking forward to having more conversations with others about. I wanted to end just by acknowledging that we know, particularly with the events that have unfolded in the last year, that there is a great need for increased relationships and understandings between people Indigenous to Turtle Island and Muslim people. And sometimes those are the same people, like Dr. Morrow. And it's so important for us to have these chains of communication open so that we can learn from each other, support each other, and work collectively at decolonization. Decolonization cannot happen without an understanding of how colonization happened. So I'm so honored to get to be a part of today's conversation. And I am very honored to hear about the work of my amazing co-panelists. Nyawa.
Thank you, Dr. Susan. And you kept your time so well. I didn't even have to interrupt or give a reminder. That's wonderful. Thank you.
It doesn't happen often.
A special vibe from today. I love your last sentence. Decolonization can't happen without knowing what colonization was. Let me then invite our last panelist, last in order, of course, not in importance, the head currently of the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds, which is in the middle of the UK, or maybe a little bit middle north, Professor of Social Theory and Decolonial Thought, founding editor of a journal called Reorient, which is dedicated to critical Muslim studies, a scholarly paradigm that he helped found from my native country, Australia, not my native city though, Adelaide, but my native country. The author of many books, including Recalling the Caliphate, Decolonization and World Order. And interestingly, I don't know if he'll mention this if it's relevant today, a book about fundamentalism that has been banned in Malaysia based on a British colonial rule, as I understand it. Fascinating. We welcome Dr. Salman Sayyid, who is 9 hours ahead of us. Thank you for staying up to talk to us here in Toronto.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers for giving me these opportunities to join this conversation. I think it's really important that we start connecting up the various ways in which the colonial experience throughout the world, we recognize that it's a global experience and has many, many different points of contact, but also dissimilarities. On the poster, it says that there will be an Indigenous and a Muslim perspective. I'm not sure I can provide a Muslim perspective. I wouldn't pretend to speak for many Muslims here and many Muslims around the world, and I think it's a tall order to provide a Muslim perspective as such. What I will try and do is see what happens if you bring Muslimness into this conversation around colonization, around treaties, and on decolonization. And to do that, I'm going to try and make 3 or 4 points, and I'm hoping that you'll allow the points to be made, and then there may be slight jump cuts, but I'm hoping that once we get to the end of the final points, that it all comes together. If it doesn't, you can always pick them up in the Q&A. So the first point I think I want to make is this, that there is a conventional narrative around Muslimness, which appears in this context of the Western Hemisphere as something like this, that there are no Muslims until immigration of the post-colonial states, and something like that. So it's quite a recent phenomenon. Now, what I'd like to suggest, the first kind of decolonial move, if you would like to put it this way, is perhaps to alert to 2 points. Maybe Muslimness was here before immigration. And I'd like to suggest in 2 ways this may be the case. One is that I would say to you that Muslimness was here virtually because the way that the Europeans came to the Americas was already motivated by a certain perception and understanding of what Muslimness was, what it might mean, what they were trying to do. So it was already part of the conversation on that. And there's been a lot of work that's been done looking at the motivations of people like Christopher Columbus, why they're trying to get here. There's also stuff which has been done in relation to how, when they actually meet Indigenous people, the kind of vocabulary and kind of concepts they have are already gleaned from the idea of the Moors or the idea of the Muslimness already there. So there's a kind of virtual Muslimness. But the second Muslimness, I think, is obviously the work which has been done recently, say recently, but work which has often been neglected, and which is that the enslaved who were brought to the United States between the United States, mainly what is now the United States, but also Brazil and other parts of the Americas, between 1/3 to half, 50% of them were actually Muslims of various kinds. So what you have in this Western Hemisphere is one of the most intense episodes of de-Islamicization which goes on. That over this kind of period, that Muslim sensibility is destroyed through the kind of horrors of the enslavement processes, etc., and related to that, and how it persists and continue to be part of that resistance. So I think that's the first kind of move that I want to make, is simply to show that the question of Muslimness can't be simply located into the question of immigration for a variety of reasons, and we can play on with different kinds of stories around that. The second big point that I want to make, and I think it goes back to the beginning when Taha talked about the funding of this event, that is really to do, and it's been present in Dr. Hill's and Dr. Morrow's talks as well, is trying to make a bridge between the past and the present. So in many ways, that when we talk about treaties, we're talking about events, which have happened seemingly hundreds of years ago, or at least 150 years ago, or whatever. So it is, and the response is always, well, with the settler colonies, and Kathy will know this, that there's a huge difference between those who say that they arrived, they're settled, but they're not guilty of anything or anything. And the question about guilt, of course, is not particularly helpful either. I mean, this is another issue here that we're talking about, how the questions of unequal treaties or inequalities becomes translated into individual things that people need to do, rather than structural problems and recognition of structural efforts at amelioration. So to make that bridge, I would like to suggest to you a very simple thing, and that is that we should understand colonialism and racism as being synonymous. Not two different things, but the one thing. And the benefit of doing that is allows us to see colonialism not in the past, not in special places, but actually running through as a thread throughout the construction of the political order in the Western Hemisphere and in the rest of the world. And it makes that connection there. And I will just give you two illustrations to make that argument. One is I suppose you could argue, is an intellectual kind of illustration. The concept of racism that we now use and deploy emerges in the 1930s to describe what the Nazis are doing to primarily the Jewish population, but also the Roma in Germany during the 1930s. This is the era of the Nuremberg laws. But if you look at what are the Nazis actually doing in Germany in the 1930s? They're not doing anything different than what the Dutch are doing in Indonesia, what the French and the British are doing, what is being done in the Russian empires. All the European imperial empires, all colonial empires, had the same kinds of legal and political framework as the Nazis were trying to introduce. They're actually arguing for themselves that we are basically imitating what the British did. We are trying to implicate in Europe or in Germany what was already operating, for example, in the United States under Jim Crow. And again, there are many, many studies which show this at a very detailed level about the application of those kinds of activities. And you can go down the list. So, for example, prohibitions on zoning of particular areas, prohibition on relations across European, non-European lines, all of that. So the question I would ask you is, why did we need two concepts if the concept of colonialism already existed and described what was happening in Nazi Germany? Why do we need to invent racism? And the answer would be, we needed to invent racism to differentiate between what happens in the developed world or developed in the West or in Europe compared to what's happening in the non-West. But that differentiation is actually what prevents decolonization. All the moments of intense decolonization have occurred when there has been a refusal to allow that separation between colonialism and racism to organize our activities of resistance. And the easiest example would be to look at the 1960s and the civil rights movement. When Martin Luther King says that he's against the Vietnam War, he doesn't need to be against the Vietnam War, but he sees the relationship between the Vietnam War and domestic colonial order. So that's the first point. The second point I would say to you is that we've already seen this in the demonstrations, and it's difficult to tell the time in the pandemic. But last year, I would say, or perhaps the year before, when you had some of the largest multinational, multi-ethnic, multicultural demonstrations in the United States against what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota. And what is interesting about those demonstrations is that they weren't just demonstrations against police brutality. They actually were decolonial demonstrations because they linked police brutality to the legacy of the colonial order. And that, it seems to me, is that we've reached a point in which there is an awareness in the general population that these things are not completely random, that there is a linkage. The way that we carry out our common practices has a past, but the past is a ghost. In a sense, it is still present with us. It is not something which has gone through. So these are just two illustrations of that. I think the third point that I want to make is one to do with understanding the depth of the colonial order. Kathy, how long have I got? Just very quickly, I'm just very conscious of time.
Yes, 1 minute if you can.
All right, so 1 minute, I'll say this in 1 minute very quickly, okay? So what we have is a sense that the world that we live in was a world that was created by the colonial racial order. And that didn't just create these kind of frontiers and boundaries, etc., but it also created the vocabulary and the concepts by which we understand ourselves and the world around us. And we've seen this many kind of played out in many, many different movements. But one category I will finish with is this. Take the category of religion. Religion is not a universal category. It is not something that's always existed. And I'll illustrate this with one simple example, that before the concept of religion came into being, when you look at the first translation of the Quran, for example, it doesn't refer to Islam as a religion. It refers to it as law, a sacred law. And if you start thinking that religion is basically Western, in the Enlightenment view of Western Christianity, and then you differentiate that from how other traditions, faiths, communities saw what we describe as religion. For them, it was a part of life. But because we are so evolved, we've been so internalizing these categories, we are now then confronted by having to deal with things as a religious question, even though we recognize that religion itself is a category of colonization and racialization rather than a category that speaks for liberation. I think I'll stop on that because otherwise I will go over time.
Thank you. That's wonderful. That's a great way to end a category of colonization and racialization. I think you said. My mind went blank for a minute. What I'd like to do now is have a discussion between all the panelists. Perhaps Beth Ann, you could spotlight all of us together, and then we'll open the floor for audience question and answer. Obviously, these are just 10-minute opening statements. We can't get into all the depth of the knowledge and research that you've done. I wanted to start with Dr. Susan, actually, the images that you had showed of the belts. I think they're called wampum belts. And you used them to, you said that the belt was an Indigenous record of what had happened. And I was wondering if you could explain sort of like the language of the weaving, what story it tells.
Sure. So I'll actually reference the two-row wampum belt. It's the easiest one to describe. And it is the physical document of the agreement. But I would also point out that it's important to understand that the oral record of the agreement is actually the agreement. And so it's the visual, but knowing that the agreement isn't whole without all of the knowledge associated with it. But in essence, there's a reason it's called the two-row wampum, because it shows two rows of purple in a bed of white. And we often in English talk about it as the river of life, that the white represents the river, and that the two sets of purple rows represent the Haudenosaunee canoe traveling down the river and the Dutch ship traveling down the river. And that our people were agreeing that we would travel always in parallel to each other, but with an understanding that as neighbors, we don't interfere with the inner workings inside the vessel of the other party. And so this has also become what I would suggest is Haudenosaunee foreign policy, in that we don't meddle in the internal affairs of our neighbors. However, when those affairs impact our affairs, then we will make it known. One of the other key lessons of that we're told is that anybody can choose to be in either vessel, but that anyone who chooses to try to have a foot in each is going to land in the water. And so in other words, you have to be firm in your principles about where you belong, and you have a responsibility to uphold what's required in either vessel, whichever that is. But also with an understanding that our people are now forever connected. And the white that separates the two rows of purple, it actually speaks to a commitment to peace, friendship, and respect. And so while we're separate in our vessels, we're bound by those principles of peace, friendship, and respect. And that I'm reminded by one of my mentors that it actually starts with the respect, that you can't have peace or friendship if you don't have respect first. And she always stresses that. Her name is Carol Jacobs, and I just wanted to mention that as well, that we have these are very deeply ingrained documents with a lot of lessons in there that are what we consider to be the law of this land. Thank you. I hope that's clear.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Salman, the story that Dr. Susan just told us about the wampum belt, which is a different kind of record making, if you like, or documentation connecting to a different kind of concepts. Is that an example of what you're talking about? The last point that you mentioned about language and concepts, that in a way it reminds me of Audre Lorde's famous feminist statement about how we can't dismantle the master's house with the master's language. Is the wampum belt an example of a different way of thinking that highlights your last point?
I think it can be. I mean, I think it's a question about how it's used, how it's deployed. And one of the issues is that many of these elements are often disconnected from the actual ways in which the community can comport themselves. To give you an example that I'm more familiar with, if you're with Islamic aid example, would be this, that if you look at the contemporary madrasas and how they are divorced from the way in which production of knowledge was actually part of the community itself, was part of the way that, so nearly every single Muslim society, you have basically a dual system of, you have almost apartheid in terms of education. You have education which is being carried out in indigenous or languages, and you have education carried out in French and English. And therefore, they don't meet, in a sense, they don't often meet. You have those kinds of, so I think that, so the point that I was trying to make is that the very idea of what creates a concept, how we differentiate ourselves, what we call ourselves, these are not just at the level of, surfaces. Really, one of the things is that it's trying to escape the possibility of museumification, because that's another thing that happens with that those experiences are put together as divorced and from the context of lived experiences and from forging of new futures, and seen as basically almost things in themselves which are static. And I think it was Dr. John Morrow was making the point about how things are in constant movement. And the thing is that it is a question about decolonization isn't a question of returning to tradition. It's actually reactivating mobility, using those resources to think about the future rather than thinking about the past. And I think that's something that is very important to bear that in mind.
Let me try to pin that point and come back to it, because I think that's a very crucial aspect of our hope here for the panel in terms of providing thought leadership. But let me turn to you now, Dr. John, again with this, with the wampum belt image and description that Dr. Susan had given us. You talked about how in Islam, you used an English phrase, a gentleman's word is his bond, I think, something along those lines, which is a British concept, and yet you were using it to illustrate an Islamic point. In your talk, you gave a very striking history of a comparison between how important covenant was to Prophet Muhammad and peace be upon him and those that followed. Mostly honored, you said, that of course there are bad leaders everywhere, in comparison with the way that treaties in America, in the United States and Canada were dishonored. Is the story of the wampum belt of the two peoples in their ship heading in the same direction but supposed to be respecting each other only ever been honored in the breach in Canada and North America? How do you compare that again with the Islamic experience?
Yes, So as I mentioned, by and large, well, at least during the Prophet's time, those treaties and covenants were honored. Certainly during the Umayyad period as well, the relations with the Christians were good. There was a period of restrictions under the Abbasids, but then things changed a bit under the Mamluks, and certainly the Ottomans returned to that tradition of honoring covenants. They issued hundreds of covenants and treaties with European nations and so on. And they were all inspired by the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians from Mount Sinai. So there was a long tradition of honoring these treaties. As you mentioned, people are human beings, and at times, it's not the cream that rises to the top, and there have been poor leaders who've violated these treaties and oppressed some of these minorities and restricted the rights and liberties, but it was always something aspirational to honor them. And sometimes when the Muslims wouldn't honor them, the Christians would remind them. They would bring these documents and say, listen, this is the treaty that your prophet made with our ancestors. We asked you to honor it. And by and large, when that would happen, there would be a revival of those rights. In terms of the interaction between Europeans and indigenous people, I mean, we're dealing with the entire continent, and there are thousands of different tribes and so on. We have the Spaniards, we have the French, the English, and so on. It's very complex. But by and large, they were disingenuous from the very beginning. There was a period during early Canadian history where the French aspired to become a new people, and that our sons will marry your daughters and we will create a new people who would be a mixed blood people. When the British came, the attitude was very different. It was not about mixing and becoming a new nation, becoming Métis, for example, honoring European ancestors and indigenous ancestry. It was about supplanting these people, dispossessing them, and taking their land. So it's a very complex issue, but by and large, the Europeans in the United States and to a large extent in Canada did not act in good faith.
And you're sort of reiterating, I think it was the middle point of what Dr. Salman had been saying about colonialism and racism as twin threads, if you like, rather than separate concepts.
And he touched upon something that was interesting to me with my background in Hispanic studies as well, about Columbus and all of that mentality. And it's true that when Columbus, traveled to the Americas and he reached the Caribbean, he came across a group of indigenous people and he tried to communicate with them. In which language did he try to communicate with them? He tried to speak with them in Arabic. He had an Arabic interpreter on board. The Spaniards had been, fighting the Moors and the Muslims and the so-called Arabs for over 800 years, from 711 to 1492. That's what motivated their entire conquest. So finally, they liberated their country from these so-called foreigners who actually weren't even foreigners. The vast majority of the Muslims in Spain were actually indigenous Iberian people. They were Spaniards whose ancestors had embraced Islam. Many of them had learned Arabic, but they all spoke Romance, which was the language between Latin and Spanish. And towards the end, as the Spanish language developed and became an independent language, the Moriscos and everything, they were Spanish speakers. Some of them, in many regions of Spain, did not even speak Arabic. They were monolingual Spanish speakers. So they're genetically Spanish people. They speak Spanish, but they treat them as others and foreigners and invaders and so on. And so finally, after 1492, they've reconquered the peninsula. They want to continue. And so they reach the Caribbean and they're looking out for Arabs. They're looking out for Muslims. And you find Cortez, when he goes to Central America and Mexico and so on, he comes across indigenous people and he notices that they're circumcised. And he says, oh my God, there must be Muslims around here. These people must be Turks. And so if you read the chronicles, they're describing indigenous people as Turks, as Turcos, and as Moros, and they say, look at this building here, we need to attack it, we need to destroy it. They describe those buildings as mezquitas, or mosques, but these were temples. The Aztecs were a polytheistic people, but this was what was motivating them in their conquest of the Americas. And so, so I thought that was a very interesting point, that mentality continues over here when they colonize these populations and so on.
Dr. Salman, let me pick up not actually the point that Dr. John was just elaborating, but his previous point. He said that when Muslim rulers were breaching the covenant, one of the things that the Christian minorities would do would basically remind them, here's the covenant that we had signed with Prophet Muhammad, as a way to remind them to re-honor and follow and have their rights more recognized. Do you think that this is an Islamic tradition or resource that can give the contemporary Canadian governments or American governments a learning or a teaching on a way forward? Something from our heritage that can be, beneficial? And remember to unmute, yeah.
Sure. But that would assume that the problem is that the American governments or the Canadian governments or the Australian governments don't know or are ignorant. I think there's a difference between arrogance and ignorance. I don't think they want to know. I don't think they particularly care. I mean, that's the fundamental issue here, that it is not the issue. It's not because if they didn't want to, they couldn't. It's not they couldn't be inspired by it. It's they choose not to be inspired by it. You have in the United States in the last 50 years, a major evangelical movement. It could easily use those resources to come to different conclusions. But even within that, you find that you can get people with a deep faith in Christianity coming to very, very different conclusions around issues of social justice. The idea that Jesus of Nazareth is basically a CEO in disguise versus the idea of Jesus as someone who is actually trying to work for the dispossessed. I mean, these are two very different conclusions you can draw upon from the tradition. So I think the issue is this, that the richness of traditions and the reason why they exist is that they allow us to generate resources and vocabularies for justice. But the work of actually doing that, generating that vocabularies, is only the first part of it. The second part is to use that to mobilize populations, to transform the way people think, and to turn that into action. And this is why I think the emphasis on the legal element misses out. Now, what we're talking about is really the necessity for activism, for people to be active in the defense. Rights can exist on paper, but they don't mean anything unless there are people who are willing to actually uphold them and use them as tools for justice. And I think we have to remember that it's not just the existence of those traditions, not there's the absence of them, but what you can do with them to make the world, your neighborhood, wherever you are, a better space, a better place.
And the experience, you mentioned at the opening of your talk, Dr. Salman, about the similarities, but also the differences between Indigenous and Muslim experiences of colonization. Do you think that Muslim communities in Britain, for example, I'm not aware of an Indigenous situation that's sort of similar to the First Nations in Canada. I don't know if the Welsh or the Scottish or the Irish, I don't know how they kind of fit into that paradigm of indigeneity. So do Muslims in Canada have a different social movement role to play than Muslims in Britain? How do we kind of bring it together in that way?
I think that the best way to bring things together is to recognize that colonialism and the racial order is a global order. And I think we can see that, for example, wherever you have that colonial racial order, the tendency is towards forms of segregation, forms of occupation. And you can see that. So, I mean, what's happening in France is really, really very interesting because we are familiar with what may have happened in Burma. We are familiar with what's happened to the Uyghurs in China or the Muslims in Kashmir or the Palestinians under Israel. But when you have a very liberal, was supposed to be an established liberal country introducing legislation, closing down organizations which are advocating anti-racism, start thinking about regulating behavior of how Muslims can express themselves and not be, it's kind of almost enforcement around things around the hijab, and then the length of the skirt, and then the idea that halal food will, if you eat halal food, you become a Muslim. I mean, all of those kinds of things. And what's happened is that in the last 30 years in France, you've seen more and more Islamophobic tendencies develop. It's becoming mainstream. And what that produces is two-tier citizenship, citizens who can have their rights taken away and citizens who can't. Now, once you have that, you're not that far away from settler and non-settler. So I think one of the biggest problems has been that because of the way that colonialism separated between settler and non-settler societies in some ways, it sort of thought, well, it actually does things differently. And of course, there are differences there, but you can also see how the dispossession and the kind of marginalization have a common parlance. So, for example, Kathy, the experience of what's happening in the Canadian establishments, how does the Canadian government dealt with Indigenous people compared to how the Australian government dealt with Indigenous people? The ability to take away children, which both those governments have done, is also something which has been enshrined in contemporary sort of countering extremism legislation in the UK, that you can actually take away children from Muslim parents because you think they may become radicalized. And we've had stories of, 3-year-olds being in danger of radicalization. So what I'm trying to say is there's a family resemblance. Like any family, you have different kind of relations, but you can see that there's a connection there. There's a family resemblance around colonialism and racism, which affects Indigenous people throughout the world, which affects Muslimness, which affects Roma, which affects different communities in different ways. And the point is to try and bring that commonality out, then to use those experiences and practices of resistance to try and see what are the best practices available in those particular circumstances.
Now I'm going to ask the last question to Dr. Susan, and then I'll open it up to the floor. I've got questions coming in on the chat. In your image of the 1701 Nan Fan Treaty, I believe you called it, and it's the first time I've heard about this. I actually don't know very much about Indigenous history in Canada. One of the last words you used there was important to know that it's not a surrender. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on what that meant. And I don't know if this is a tall order for you, but can you connect it sort of to what Dr. Salman has been saying about the colonialism/racist order, the family of resemblances, how it looks in Canada, in France, in the UK, and in Canada, and to connect the struggle of current Indigenous peoples in Canada to that sort of more global colonial order that he's trying to spotlight for us?
I will do my best. So I emphasize the particular of that treaty not being a surrender, because that's not the way that it's often been characterized by historians. However, there's some amazing evidence that exists in the colonial records of the British imperial government that notes that the Haudenosaunee understanding of the treaty was that this was not a surrender. And it's important to note as well for any legal folks who might be listening today that the St. Anne's case in the Supreme Court of Canada recognizes that where there's ambiguity about interpretation of a treaty, that the law requires the Indigenous understanding of the treaty to be the primary interpretation of that treaty. And so there's plenty of evidence that notes that this was not understood to have been a surrender of land from the Haudenosaunee. So in other words, the GTA was not surrendered by the Haudenosaunee, and the 1701 treaty was the British recognition that that was Haudenosaunee territory. I'm not suggesting that means that other peoples, other Indigenous peoples who've lived in that area are not also Indigenous to it, but it is a British recognition of Haudenosaunee rights to that land. And given that there is no subsequent surrender, it is a recognition of the fact that this land is still Haudenosaunee territory, recognized and understood by the Crown. And so that's extremely important because in Canadian context, Canada likes this neat, and there's been literally millions of dollars invested in trying to clean up the treaty record that is mostly absent in British Columbia, for example. So Canada likes to have things neatly packaged and compartmentalized, particularly around title to land, because once one has title to land, they are free to exploit it as they see fit. And without title, there will always be questions about exploitation. And whenever people, and I think hopefully this will help sort of tie together the parts that you were asking about. When we think about the global world that we're all a part of, we know that exploitation of people, land, and resources is the way that the global economy has been built. We also know that the global economy is dependent upon the further exploitation of people, land, and resources. And when that is massive, massive issues, particularly around environmental degradation and around the abuses of people. And those go hand in hand. They're not separate or independent from each other. This is all tied to a global economic ideology that requires, honestly, advancement that it can only come at the expense of people, lands, and resources. And I include water in that as well. And so thinking about that and thinking about the ways in which racism, oppression help to feed that, we can't discount that. We need to be aware of those economic pieces that tie that together. And I think, although I don't have a ton of knowledge about it, I think that's a lot of what's happening in France as well, particularly more probably aligned with financial fear and concern, particularly whenever you have people who identify in communal ways, which is often the case in many Muslim communities. Whenever people identify communally, that's seen as a challenge to unchecked capitalism. So I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to look through the chat and pose questions that have been coming into me to the panelists. So the first one says, since Muslims and Indigenous people have so much in common, do we know of groups or organizations that are both Muslim and Indigenous? Is there a way to connect with them? So I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to take that question. Maybe I could actually, go ahead.
Indigenous Muslims are few and far between. However, there are Indigenous Muslims. I mean, when I travel, I come across them all the time in South Dakota and elsewhere. Pretty much everywhere I go, you'll find Indigenous people. Some of them are organized. There are some online communities. There was one group, a Muslim group, an Islamic group based out of the UK that reached out to me, and they said they want to start some big dawah or proselytization campaign among Indigenous people, and they wanted to do it in a culturally sensitive fashion, and so they reached out to me and wanted my help. I never responded because I looked into who they were and what their background was. This is a radical Salafi organization based out of the UK, and so they're the last people on earth that I would like to introduce to Indigenous people and have them to try to spread their interpretation of Islam. So yeah, I mean, that's what I have to say. And yeah.
All right, thank you. To the person who's asked this question, I suggest you actually get in touch with Tahara Yua from Justice for All Canada. There are groups that I don't know if they're Muslim and Indigenous in the same person, like Dr. John, but groups that are working together from each side. So you can connect with Tahara Yua from Justice for All Canada. I think that'll help you connect. Next question. I would like to ask the panel about the place of violence in decolonisation. So I don't know if who would like to speak to that? The place of violence in decolonisation. Go ahead, Dr. Salman.
Yeah, I mean, I would suppose we could start by looking at the place of violence in colonization and the continuing violence in racism. So I think the idea of violence it's interesting because the things that we so become inured to that we don't actually recognize them as being violent. So what constitutes violence is the first kind of question. I think the more important issue for me would be that ultimately decolonization to be meaningful is really a contestation around the ability of people to be able to exercise and write their own histories, to be able to be themselves, to be able to choose their own kind of destinies to whatever extent they want to. And the question about violence, in a sense, is only arises because what would resistance be like? It doesn't have to be violent if you mean by violent what you see on TV, but what you see on TV is not the violations which kills hundreds of millions of people every day because we don't associate them with violence. So the question really is, one, what would constitute violence? And secondly, is what would resistance be like? And I think that's where I would want to start. Now, once we accept that, then there are protocols and things you could say, well, I think this kind of thing is excessive or that kind of thing is excessive. But ultimately, this is a political struggle. And what defines a political struggle is the difference between those who agree with you, who want to help and support you, and those who oppose you. And if those who oppose you are as strident in their opposition to you, then you have the choice. They will exercise violence. I mean, the breach of treaties that we've been discussing were not necessarily non-violent events. They often led to displacement, they led to violations, they led to all kinds of acts of violence. So, but often it's the other way around. I mean, just give you a very, very simple example of this. If you look at the classic Western, which is involved in there, what is it a story of? It's a story of basically European settlers arriving in, but they're the ones who are attacked. The act of actually arriving in the territory is completely erased as an act of violence itself or act of invasion. It is they're minding their own business, we identify with them, and they are attacked for some unknown reason by these faceless, shouting people. That's the narrative structure of nearly all classical Westerns. And there, the question of who is violating becomes very, very clear. It is the native, the indigenous, who is carrying out the violence. It's the native who's carrying out the costs. But the actual initial violence is completely erased. And I think we have to be very, very careful when we talk about decolonization, not to be caught up in the narrative of the Western.
Dr. Susan, would like to add something?
No, I think what's been shared is brilliant and really important points for people to think about. I would just add for people to be conscious consumers of media, because what often gets displayed as violence is without the context of what created it, and also without a nuanced analysis around resistance. And so I think it's very important to be critical consumers of the information that comes our way.
Dr. John, would you like to add something?
Well, I'm not going to advocate violence, but I mean, there is a time and place where it's necessary. I mean, Louis Riel understood that. He tried political advocacy, he tried legal avenues and so on, but settlers kept coming in and coming in and coming in. So he reached a point where he had to resort to violence. To protect their homes and their property and their rights. I certainly wouldn't advocate that now. The Quran says don't cast yourself into destruction. I think inciting violence is suicidal when you're 1% of the population. But there are many other means of resistance that should be used. And of course, people are entitled to defend themselves.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next question. My question is that as a nation, how do we even begin to decolonize the current European law system, since Indigenous law and traditions existed prior and supersedes, and clearly imperialism is still in charge? Wet'suwet'en and land back 1492 in Caledonia illustrates this original tradition versus the imposed band council European system. Yet the Canadian government is getting a bite of its own law in the mishandling of the truckers doing their sit-in. There's a lot in that question, but would anyone on the panel like to speak to that question? Dr. Susan, would you like to?
I will try. I would say you have to be careful to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And while the ideas that this person is putting forward are not wrong, we have to be careful in terms of, we can't talk about treaty, for example, without a recognition of the rights of the British descended settler state to exist here. However, we have to go back and look at the treaty and see what are the terms of that agreement. And that is the base, I would suggest, for how we move forward collectively. While certainly lots of the people in my community would love to have more of our land back, we know that the way to do that is not by kicking people out of their homes. It's about communication. It's about working together, and it's about that was promised collectively by our shared ancestors, whether those are our genetic relatives or not, and understanding the principles that were being agreed to around sharing a space, and particularly the emphasis that was demanded that everybody be conscious of how to make sure the generations yet unborn would be able to continue to benefit from these places. And that is really where we find a basis for a respect around environmental restoration, environmental protections that we know as humans we're completely dependent on for the future. And so we can actually find everything that we need, at least in this context, in those treaty relationships in order to move forward. It doesn't mean that we follow it to the letter. It means that we think about what did we mean with these agreements and how do we enact them respectfully in the context of our contemporary lives. Because I'm confident it can be done, but it does require a lot of work. And I am very excited about the work that is being done by a number of legal scholars in that area, in trying to help Canada and the US and other settler states think through how they can actually become honorable nations. Because I would suggest to you, to date, they have not.
I'm very happy to hear you use the word hope, because that's very inspiring. Dr. John, you'd like to say something?
Well, I mean, from a legal point of view, when you're negotiating nation to nation, that's on the basis of treaties and so on. And so, of course, you ask the state to honor this treaty. But in some cases, I think many of these treaties need to be tossed in the garbage bin, and that people need to recognize that they were immoral and unethical from the very beginning, and try to come to a just solution or agreement. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Dr. Salman, would you like to add anything? Oh, mute.
I think Dr. Susan and Dr. John have covered the ground really well, and I don't have anything meaningful to add to what they've just said.
All right, then the next question is actually directed to you by name, so you'll be off the hook for that one, but not this one. The question is, Salam, can Prof. Sayyid comment on the tendencies present in Islamicate elites and West toxified middle classes to divert and any Muslim decolonial effort into the dominant Kemalist discourse? In other words, making Islam into a set of private rituals. Jazakallah khair.
I can comment on that, and I would say, and I think it goes back to a point that Dr. Susan made about the idea of communality or the communal living, and how that often incentivates a particular kind of attention from different kinds of government. I think the idea is that Islam should be treated as a religion, and religions are what people do in the privacy of their homes, or at a sort of a specified time in a specified building in a specified way. And if you have a concept of the idea of Islam or Hinduism or any of the kind of other kind of traditions and things which don't simply are not containable in the same way, then you have a problem in relation to how the organization of the contemporary state, which prides itself on being secular. What it actually means right now, secularity, more and more at this current conjuncture, means the undoing of Muslimness. And you see that in a very careful in what's happening to the Uyghurs, where the Chinese administration is using language from two different sources, one from the countering violent extremism discourse, which has been circulating around for the last 20 years, plus older language about Muslim backwardness, fanaticism, etc., to basically say that we want to modernize these Uyghur Muslims. This is why we need them to drink alcohol. This is why we need them to not to have any knives bigger than 2 inches or something like that. All of that kind of, and the kind of surveillance technology that's been put in place to regulate that kind of Muslimness in a way. So I think there's the tendency in a way is simply this, that there isn't a Muslim political subject right now. There are people who say they're Muslims, but they're not able to articulate that significantly in robust enough ways to say that Muslimness becomes a political subject, that it becomes a political identity, that you can say that being a Muslim here or there means certain things in relation to particular kinds of actions. And that means that you don't have that, and you then have a situation in which different regimes throughout the world will make different kinds of concessions and bargains to maintain themselves in power, especially when their ability to stay in power is undermined by a lack of legitimacy and an inability to simply have a population in which they can have any confidence and trust. So I think these are kind of structural problems, and of course one can see how they're supported. One of the odd things is this, that outside the history of probably Europe, the United States has always been a supporter of authoritarian rule. In Europe, you could argue during the Second World War and the Cold War, there was a kind of idea that it was an engine of liberation. But if you ask people in Latin America or Southeast Asia or Africa, nearly in every single case, you will find that the United States, for example, was supporting apartheid regimes in South Africa, Rhodesia, etc., and now Israel. So I think the idea of this being to do with Muslims, particularly Muslim elites, as something internal to them, I think we need to see it as a broader perspective, that these are basically making bargains to stay and to safeguard their privileges, and to imagine themselves as being Europeanized. And I think one of the questions we had before was, what is the situation with Muslim immigrants? Many of the Muslim immigrants did not identify with those dispossessed. They didn't identify with indigenous people. They did not identify with the racialized minorities, let's say in the United States and elsewhere. It's only recently that they've started to see this kind of thing. So I think we have to say there's a kind of a process of education. Many of them came from very, very bourgeois backgrounds and thought of themselves as being white. I mean, there's a kind of, and I don't mean that as a phenotype, I mean that as a kind of a state of mind. So there has been a process of education needed among the Muslim communities to see themselves as part of that kind of process of a global Islamophobia, which is actually which is a type of racism.
I think that's part of what these panel series, this is actually the 3rd annual lecture, trying to bring Muslim and Indigenous perspectives together, precisely for that purpose, to try to raise these issues and show the parallels. All right, Last question I have here. How to come to this just solution and agreement given asymmetric power relations and ongoing post-colonial violence? I guess you could call this the $64 million question. How to come to this just solution and agreement given asymmetric power relations and ongoing political post-colonial violence? Who would like to go first? Dr. Salman.
Yeah, I can say that. Look, I think the first thing you start off is with the idea of hope, because you can make things better. And in a sense, if you're a person of faith or a person of no faith, but a person of conviction, then surely one of the things is to make a world a better place. I mean, that's a kind of a basic obligation that we have. So I think it's very, very important that we're not hopeless. We don't see things completely as predetermined to complete failure. And the history of resistance and struggle becomes inspiring because people with less resources, with less means, have carried on the struggle for justice and have found themselves to be vindicated, have made things better for those who resist. So I think it's important that not to be daunted by the asymmetrical relations of power, to recognize it, to be smart about it, to be strategic about it, but then don't say, that's not the point of the point about struggling for justice is precisely to struggle against asymmetric relations of power, because that's one of the main causes of injustice. So I think there are important lessons to be learned from the histories that have been often suppressed or erased of resistance. Not because you want to simply imitate what happened there, but simply say, look, these people, if they could do it, then we can try and do something. And through that experience to learn, I think there's a lot to be learned by making these connections across the world to see where resistance has worked and where it hasn't worked, and what we can learn from the ways that has worked. And it may not be every single situation is the same situation, but unless we improve our literacy around the questions of resistance, then we condemn ourselves to simply suffering in silence or suffering in isolatedly. One of the biggest things that the exercise power does is tries to atomize this. It tries to separate communities rather of resistance and say that they're on their own and they're so peculiar. And then what happens is that we end up a lot of time emphasizing those small differences rather than actually thinking about building coalitions or powerful coalitions, broad-ranging coalitions. And I think that's the work that has to be done.
Dr. John, do you like to add something?
Sure, there isn't just one solution. There are just so many problems. There's a 1,001 things that people can do. There's no magic wand. I mean, I've lived in Indiana for 10 years, and I feel a duty to try to advocate for the indigenous people from this state. By hook or by crook, they were dispossessed of their land. Their land was stolen. On top of that, they were expected to leave the state. And so they were expelled to Oklahoma, where there are about 5,000 Miami indigenous people. Eventually, half the tribe decided to come back. So there's about 2,500 of them here. And the federal government has refused for centuries to recognize their very existence. They say, no, we just recognize the Miami Indians who are on the reservation in Oklahoma. We don't recognize any of the Miami people who are in the state of Indiana who tried to return to their homeland. And the Miami Nation of Indians here spent fortunes, and these are very, very poor people, spent fortunes trying to lobby the government, the federal government, in order to get recognition from the U.S. government that they are an indigenous tribe. And it failed, and it failed, and it failed. But you know what? They went and they appealed to the state governments. And the state government says, you know what, you are the indigenous people of the land, we recognize you. So they achieved state recognition, even though they didn't obtain federal recognition. And the other thing that I find incredible with the state of Indiana is that they recognize the Métis people. Now, throughout most of the United States, they recognize Native Americans, Indian people. And so the Métis had two choices. Well, we'll go back to white communities, or they were integrated into indigenous indigenous tribes, like Turtle Mountain in North Dakota. Their Chippewa relatives embrace them as part of their tribe. So yeah, I mean, there are good things. If one avenue doesn't work, then you explore another one. If one door is closed, then you open another one. But yes, I think that there are many things that people can do. Absolutely. Don't try to lead, try to serve, reach out to people, make friends, whatever skills you have, offer them. Yeah. So tiny little steps, that's the way to move forward as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Dr. Susan, would you like to say something?
Sure. For me, it's about a pursuit of peace. And what I'm constantly reminded of by our knowledge keepers is that peace isn't a destination. Peace is a state of being. And it might exist for a moment, but it can't continue to exist without constant work. And so it isn't just something that we can get. It has to always be a part of our conscious effort, that we cannot assume that things are okay and so that idea that it must always be foremost in our minds is really important, and understand that it's about relationship between people, among people, and with the natural world, and that relationships need constant tending. And so it isn't something that we can just put in a 5-year plan and get there and we're done. It is part of our ongoing plan for all time.
I agree. It's definitely, it's a journey. We're not looking for a revolution. We're looking for incremental steps.
We have about 2 minutes left.
Ways to be together.
We have about 2 minutes left for this segment, and I'm taking one last question that I'll read to you, and then if I can just get the panelists to give a short, concise and pithy answer if possible. It says, you've discussed the similarities between Indigenous and Muslim struggles, but where do you see them depart? So I don't know if anyone would like to go first.
I think one of the quickest issues is that the Muslim struggle is perhaps far more global. It has far more recognition. It involves different kind of dynamics of power. It has states, it has armies. So it's a kind of it's different in that regard as well. It can't be simply contained just within this kind of one framework. So I think that's one of the issues. It's far more extensive, and that has both weaknesses and strengths on that.
Dr. Susan or Dr. John, would you like to add something?
I agree with Dr. Salman that the scale is often different, although I would suggest that the opportunity of support is always present, but that it also requires people to be thinking on a grander scale than just whatever their immediate identity might be. And that's something everybody can do. It isn't something that's limited based upon if you belong to a group of people that are, 50 million or a group of people that are 500. There's, so much more that that can be done in terms of thinking in that sense. And I would suggest that pursuit of peace is the place where we can find common ground always.
Thank you. And Dr. John.
Yes, this is a problem that I encountered with the Muslim community for a very long time, that the focus was always abroad. It was, their homeland or their country of origin. The struggle was Palestine, it was Kashmir. If you're dealing with issues of poverty, education, whatever, injustice, it was always sending money abroad, helping people there. And, I told them, well, what about the people here? What about the poor people in our community? What about Indigenous people? You know, don't you care about us? I mean, you live here, you're a citizen. And the mentality over time has changed. I worked with Islamic Relief to help the Indigenous people on the Crow Creek Reservation in South Dakota, along with my wife. It was their first outreach effort among Indigenous people. There was some hostility from certain sectors that this is money for Muslims. It should only go to Muslims. It should go to our people. But this is how you build bridges with communities. And so now increasingly, a lot of these Islamic charitable foundations, they don't just help people abroad, they help people locally, all people. They help people where the need is. And so I think that's a tremendous accomplishment that I've seen over the past few decades. More and more, you have Muslim leaders reaching out to Indigenous people. I've been to Islamic conferences where they deliberately went out of their way to invite local Indigenous leaders to address certain issues, to build those bridges, to build those relationships, which is, you know, definitely a positive development.
And that brings us to this section of the afternoon to a close. I'll be turning it over to Dr. Naveen for closing remarks, but I just want to thank you very much, very, very much from the bottom of my heart for your thoughts, for your words, for your proddings, for your intellectual stimulation, for pointing us towards hope, towards peace building, towards resistance, towards solidarity, and to community and allyship. Thank you so much for spending us this time. And now I turn it over to Dr. Naveen.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for assisting in moderating and also in organizing this wonderful panel. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Susan Hill for your beautiful sharing of information about the 1701 beaver hunting grounds treaty that I knew nothing about, and that actually affirms Haudenosaunee rights to the area where I live in the GTA, and that it was not a land concession or land surrender, and that it actually paints or indicates a way forward for hope and for Canada to honor this treaty and to become an honorable nation when it comes to Indigenous rights and Indigenous communities. Thank you so much for that and for your wonderful comments. Thank you, Dr. John Andrew Morrow, for sharing with us something about the Islamic tradition and the example of the Prophet Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran when it comes to honoring covenants and honoring treaties, and how these have been honored in so many instances in Islamic history. And also for pointing out to some of the abuses of treaties in our current context in Turtle Island, and how important it is to resist and to bring justice to Indigenous peoples here in Turtle Island. Dr. Salman Sayyid, thank you so much for your wonderful comments and sharing with us something about colonialism and its relationship to racism, that these are very closely related and maybe even the same phenomenon. And also about slavery and how history here was conditioned by perceptions of Muslimness here in South America, but also maybe in North America as well. Thank you so much. Kathy, thank you for doing such a wonderful job in moderating and leading this panel. I'd also like to thank Munib Nasir of the Olive Tree Foundation and Tal Ghayur of Justice for All. Thank you for supporting this panel. And also I'd like to thank Jonathan Hamilton Diabo for helping organize this panel today. And I'd also like to thank Beth Ann Fisher, Andrew Etchison, and Sean Houston for their support of this panel and and assistance in organizing this panel. I'd also like to thank all of you for your attendance today and for your presence and for your questions. And I end with a greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum. We look forward to seeing you hopefully next year in our next event, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Naveen, and thank you. I echo all the thanks. And on behalf of the Center for Religion and its Context, I'd like to thank again Kathy and Naveen and Jonathan for assembling today's panel, and special thanks to all our sponsors. And I just wanted to quickly share, as admissions counselor and recruitment coordinator at Emmanuel College, a couple of upcoming events that may be of interest to folks. And I'm just putting those in the chat. We specifically have our open house virtually being held in March 5th. So please check that out. And there is a Muslim Alumni Student Network event that's coming up. That would be a great opportunity to learn more about the programming here at Emmanuel. So thank you all for joining us today, and be well.
Thank you.